Welcome to Rates and Barrels. It is Thursday, January 23rd. Derek Van Riper, Eno Saris here with you, continuing the position preview series, part 2 out of 3, focusing on outfielders. Yesterday, day 1 of the outfield previews, we got through about pick 120 overall in terms of the outfielders we covered, so you can go back and listen to that if you want the early outfielders. If you want these mid-round guys, we're going to focus on them for the next 90 minutes or so. It's kind of funny because there are no real tiers in the outfield at this point. They're all just connected to each other with very small gaps. Nevertheless, we'll try and find some values along the way and maybe point out a few players that we're not excited about at their current prices as well. Join our Discord with the link in the show description. Within the Discord, you can find links to the Hive Mind rankings for all the position previews that have gone out so far. So the infield, all available, and the outfield, which is deeper, goes 50 players if you're going to participate in those rankings. All those links are in the Discord, so be sure to jump in and do that. We'd love to compile those and share those with everybody once we get a nice batch of those in. How's it going for you on this Thursday?
Good. Going to see a show tonight. Excited about that. Continuing the arguments about the Dodgers. I looked, and in the last 4 years, Chad Young brought something up, so I looked, and in the last 4 years, 6 of the top 10 in playoff wins have come from the top 10 in payroll, and 2 have come from the bottom 10 in payroll, and 2 from the middle. So there might be some evidence that money can buy you championships, I guess. But there was another piece out from Baseball Prospectus that looked at teams' ability to change their win totals year to year. And the Gini coefficient, which is the sort of relationship of inequity, within win structure. So basically saying, are there a lot of 110 win teams and 110 loss teams, that sort of stuff, and looked at it within the history of baseball and found that we are in an unremarkable place when it comes to those things. And that the 70s in particular, the Gini coefficient was much higher, and the ability for teams to change their lot in life was much lower. And the 70s is right before free agency started, so it's an interesting time slot. So anyway, then there's the whole discussion about whether or not a cap would actually help, which involves other sports, and it's all very complicated, and we'll continue the conversation here. But we are here to talk about outfielders, and the thing I wanted to say other than that was we do have a bias towards maybe towards 15-team leagues and weekly leagues and leagues maybe with shorter benches. So if you hear us talk about injury risk and you have an unlimited IL slot in your team, then you can maybe discount that player less than we will, because you will probably, especially if it's maybe 10 teams with unlimited ILs, because then your waiver, although the waiver list will be affected. If you have unlimited ILs, you won't have as much on the waiver wire, but your replacement level could be something you factor in. Somebody brought up in my DMs about Tyler Glasnow getting 130 great innings from him, plus what you can get off the waiver wire. It is a meaningful thing. In a 15-team league, it's not super meaningful. Like, you're not getting the greatest players off the waiver wire. So that's where our biases come into play. Another one is I've been trying to throw in some draft and hold and some a best ball analysis, because best ball, you really like variability. In draft and hold, you kind of hate variability. You kind of want safety, So, there are these different biases that we have, and we're just trying to excavate those biases in front of you and give you analysis for different kinds of leagues.
Yeah, is as wide of an approach as we can reasonably take. It's why it's player analysis. What do we like about this player? What concerns us about this player? And you can try to apply that a little bit more specifically to leagues. But as Eno said, it's kind of framed around a 15-team mixed league sort of conversation. So keep that in mind throughout this series. Tier 5, as I guess we'll call it in the outfield, does run from pick 120 to 150 or so up through the end of round 10 of a 15-team league. It's a fun group again. Ian Happ, Mike Trout, Pete Crow-Armstrong, Randy Arozarena, Dylan Cruz, Steven Kwan, Adolis García, and Jasson Dominguez are the players that are clustered here together. Mike Trout being in this group is just jarring to me, man. Like 2 years ago was the last time he played triple-digit games, and he's still a barrel machine. Like the little bit we saw him in 2024, he popped 10 homers, went 6 for 7 as a base stealer in 29 games. So the potential roto goodness seems like it's still there, even as his body continues to betray him now that he's 33. Is the risk-reward situation one you're comfortable with Trout at this point? Because we've talked about projecting playing time based on what we've seen over the last 3 years, and you're not going to get a very large plate appearance number from Mike Trout doing some back-of-the-napkin math, Marcelling your way to a number based on how banged up he has been in recent seasons.
Yeah. Marcel projection for him would be maybe like 300 plate appearances for this season. The actual projection systems have him somewhere between 480 and 560. And then I just wanted to bring up a guy. We talked about him a lot. We ended with a Brian Reynolds party at the end of last season. I just want to say that these projections in 480 to 560 plate appearances look superior to Brian Reynolds.
Yeah, man. That's the thing about Trout. And just as you were saying before, using the Glass Now example on the pitching side, is you get to replace him when he's hurt, or if he's out for significant periods of time. If it's day-to-day stuff, maintenance where he's getting days off, weekly leagues, you can't always get a substitute in there. But if he's on the IL for a month or two, you're not taking a zero. You're shuffling in the best available outfielder or the best available bat based on how you shuffle lineup around. So I don't think this is a bad value. I do think that lower number you referenced, which is alongside the ATC projection right now, Fangraphs, the 482 plate appearances, seems much more realistic, right? Because the 2022 season I was referencing before, that 40 home run year, he played 119 games, was 499 plate appearances.
Superior to Brian Reynolds' projection, though. 255, 28 homers, 8 stolen bases, and 482 from ATC. So I think if you go in with that as an expectation, I think you might be pleasantly surprised. You might get a good health year from Mike Trout. I don't have a strong case against him at this price. It just feels like enough of a discount where if you have not built a lot of injury risk into your foundation already, you should feel pretty good about Trout where he's going. I think also, there's a question of like how motivated will he be to stay on the field? Will the Angels be bad again, and he doesn't care to get back on the field? I do actually wonder if there becomes a time when he kind of might be motivated by his legacy. He's a Hall of Famer already. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say.
I don't think you kicked another hornet's nest just now, but hey, we'll find out in about 8 hours.
But, he'd have like a no doubt first ballot Hall of Fame kind of approach, I think, if he got to some numbers like at least 400 homers, or, you know what I mean? Like he is starting to make people wonder if there's a little bit too much of a David Wright situation here, like he is, not tapering well. And so I wonder if, I think, people care about their legacy, even if they will admit it or not publicly. And so even if the Angels are bad, I could see him having some motivation to play a decent season, play a full season.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the case of Trout, he's had to deal with
maybe
the organizational...
play his way out of Anaheim at some point.
Well, he's played with the organizational frustration in Anaheim his whole career, and this is what he's been able to do despite that. So I don't worry about motivation and things for him. I think it's more just doing the things that just keep him healthy, and there's a lot of things he has to do to stay on the field. But I don't think it's impossible, even though recent seasons have been mostly unkind on the health front for Trout. Ian Happ does go a little bit before him. I see Happ and I see Brian Reynolds with maybe a slightly different tilt, where in an OBP league, Happ gets a bump. In an average league, he gets a little bit of a ding, but I think he's just a nice player, and there's projections agreement pretty much across the board on what Happ brings to the table at this point in his career.
Yeah, projectable, easy, a lot of baseline results. At 30, not quite into the place where you'd be worried about a precipitous decline. So with power, speed, just a decent guy across the board. And then this, I just wanted to throw this up on the screen because this made me laugh. In the second half last year, Ian Happ had almost exactly the same barrel rate, max EV, hard hit, reach, chase rate, and swing strike rate as Jackson Chourio. I'm sorry. I'm not trolling you. It's just literally something I saw and laughed and wanted to bring to you. I'm not saying Ian Happ is Jackson Chourio. I'm just saying Ian Happ is actually a pretty decent player. And if you're risk averse, he's probably a better pick than Mike Trout.
I'm so tired right now. Like I want to punch back, and I feel like I just have nothing in my legs anymore. I'm just wobbly. I
realize the age difference. I know Chourio has more upside. I just laughed.
I'm not trolling you, but I'm trolling you. I don't really know where you were going with that, other than to say Happ's not a bad player.
Yeah, that's it.
That's about it. Let's go to the other Cub in this group, though, Crow-Armstrong. He's been frequently discussed on this show over the past year or so. 27 for 30 as a base stealer last year. Popped 10 homers, and that was just 410 plate appearances. I think when I look at PCA, one of the things that kind of stands out is the K rate came in a little lower than I expected, 23.9%. Not bad for his first extended run as a regular.
Better in the second half, 22.5 in the second half, although September he kind of burst back up again.
But the thing that we've always liked about Pete Crow-Armstrong is that he is a phenomenal center fielder, and it's to the point where he will play a ton. So you have speed, efficiency on the base paths right away, a hitter that's at least good enough to hold his own with the potential to get better. So now that we've seen some of the underlying numbers, a 36.8% hard hit rate last year, 7.4% barrel rate, not bad again for a 22-year-old with the first prolonged run in the big leagues. I think you can talk yourself into growth. It's just how much growth do you get this season? Is it going to take more time, or is the full breakout coming right here in 2025 from Pete Crow-Armstrong?
Yeah, and you had that second half that gave us a peak of maybe what a full kind of breakout season would be for him, because in the first half he had a 64 WRC plus and a 582 OPS, and was mostly living on his defense, which is so elite that I actually voted in the not the Fielding Bibles, the Sports Info Solutions awards that they give out, and I voted him as the best center fielder. The second half for Pete Crow-Armstrong, 262, 310 OBP, 425 slugging, 104 WRC plus. I think that is a reasonable thing to hope for from him. 260 average. It's not what he's projected for. I think it's a reasonable thing to hope for. He's projected for sort of 240 to 250 with 14 homers. If you could hope for maybe 18 homers, a 260 average, and 40 homers, that's something to hope for. You pay for the the 240 to 250, 14 homers, and 30 stolen bases. I think the elite defense will keep him out there. The one caveat I have is that even if he has elite defense and he's out there every day, you may not want to put him down for 650 plate appearances, because there was a piece in The Athletic by Sahadev and Patrick Mooney, just these are the things we've heard, and there was a whole section about who will lead off, and they basically had like two people, like a person in the front office and Craig Counsell, say not Pete. Which
not Pete.
Not Pete. That's how they ended the article. Not Pete. So Pete is not going to lead off. I mean, he did have moments where his OBP became above average across the league, and you saw maybe he could be a leadoff guy. But I think in this year it won't be him. So is 580 plate appearances what he's projected for? A little bit low, maybe. But I also wouldn't push it to 650 and just I think it's much safer to use the 580 as a baseline.
Right, because it could be the bottom third of the order for all of this season. And maybe longer term with that growth that you could see, then there's a flip to the top of the order. Or
yeah,
top
like
of
I
the
said,
order
his
against
great
righties.
second half was a 104 WRC plus. Like maybe he's just a guy who's an average bat but a great glove.
One of the tools I like to use, by the way, just to look back at lineup position, I find at Baseball Reference, they have the batting orders tab on the team pages. You can go back and then you can click a player, highlights where that player hit. Across the bottom, it shows you how many games each player started in each slot in the batting order. So Ian Happ, 66 games in the leadoff spot last year. Nico Horner, 65 for the Cubs. I think Mike Tauchman came in third with 26, and like Wisdom and Christopher Morel had 4 and 1 respectively. But yes, I do think it's still probably more of a Happ or Horner situation up top, health permitting, with those two guys. So that does work against Pete Crow-Armstrong a bit in terms of counting stats. Could be a Cubs lineup that takes another step forward, though, with the addition of Tucker that we talked about in part 1 of our outfield series. Randy Arozarena.
Before we get to Cruz, and including Arozarena, what are we looking at in would you rathers at other positions right now?
That's a great question.
Because I like these players, and I'm like, yeah, I would like to have Happ. Oh yeah, PCA 30 to 40 steals in my outfield with non-zero homers. Yeah, I'd like that. But I don't think I have a draft where I have one of these guys yet.
All right, snap calls. Here are the 4 players going just in front of Ian Happ by ADP right now, last 14 days. Luis Garcia Jr. versus Happ.
Happ.
Cassis versus Happ.
Cassis, first base gets real dicey late.
Yeah, I'm with you on these first two. I like Cassis better, and I do like Happ better than Garcia. Logan O'Hoppe versus Ian Happ.
Well, that's a 2-catcher situation. I think I might go with Happ because I think, listen, if I don't have a catcher at all, then I'm taking O'Hoppe.
Okay, so situation.
But if I have a catcher, I think I might take Happ because I don't know.
All right, Royce Lewis versus Ian Happ.
I have made this decision, and I took Lewis. But that was also because I didn't have a third baseman yet. If I did have a third baseman, I would be pretty happy to not take Royce Lewis. I think I was sort of desperate for a third baseman when I took Lewis. So
I'll give you 2 more names. Ezekiel Tovar versus Ian Happ.
Happ.
And Bo Bichette versus Happ.
We're getting towards the bottom of shortstop here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This is already like 10th and 11th shortstop probably.
Yeah, you got Volpe still available a little later in some drafts, Xavier Edwards. But yeah, shortstop starts to wane a little bit.
I like Volpe enough, I might take Happ.
Okay. All right. So appropriately priced at the top. I think, do you like Trout more than Happ, or is that just me, by the way?
I'm finding myself to be pretty risk averse these days.
Coward. I'm not saying like draft out every health grade F player and like, I'm not saying to do that. That's absurd. But
well, I've just found that there are lots of bad health grade players available later in the draft, and I'm yes. I give myself the ability to draft those guys if I don't draft them early. So
okay, we need like a rolling counter for how much like injury risk you've taken on a cumulative health grade to then know how many of those darts you could throw late. It needs to be like we have draft software that we can use that tracks how we're doing and counting stats, average, all that stuff. But we just need like a risk meter, like an actual, hey, take a shot here. You've been boring and oatmeal-y. You've been super conservative with your build like Eno. You can take a chance now, or the opposite.
Yeah, you could maybe do it with like projected IP and PA. Something that's just like a innings pitch counter with like that's like really conservative. That's like just like dings all the health grade people down to like 80 innings pitch and stuff, and
do little cutouts of our head.
Yeah, if you're like a head, like something that's like, oh, this is what the league's averages or the rest of the league is doing. This is what your IP is doing. Like, because what I did in my drafting holes, I went Corden Burns, Logan Webb, Ryan Pepio, and I felt like I had a pretty good base of decent health grades there. So that allowed me later to take Sandy Alcantara and Luis Garcia, which are returning from surgery, and I have no idea what they'll give me. But I did balance it out.
Note to self, quantify risk more effectively throughout draft. Do not use gut feel quite so much. All right, so speaking of gut feel, Randy Arozarena is in this tier. at the time that he was traded to Seattle, we talked about going from one difficult place to hit to another. I think you hear a lot of similar complaints about the Trop that you've heard about T-Mobile Field. Batter's eyes tricky, righties have struggled there, like just kind of similar chatter, I think we could classify it as, right? So I wasn't really worried about Randy Arozarena in that regard. He'd already produced well in a difficult situation, 20 plus homers now 4 years in a row, 20 plus steals 4 years in a row. I think he's still mostly that player. It's interesting, though, that the projections are starting to pull down that batting average to an uncomfortable level. And it's a rough slope, right? I mean, the first regular season where he was a full-time player in Tampa Bay, it was a 274 with a 356 OBP, down to 263, 254, and then a 219 last year. There's been a little bit of an increase in K rate over the last 3 years, got up to 26.1% overall last year, including 28.5% after the trade. So yeah, maybe there was some adjustment to the new park built in. But Randy Arozarena isn't so old that it should all be falling apart. He's going to turn 30 at the end of February. I guess I'm wondering, how much would you be worried about the barrel rate in the second half, basically post-trade, dropping all the way to 5.3%? Because I feel like the floor for the power does take a hit if he's not able to barrel the ball the way he was previously. I'm surprised. Like, to me, it seems like a blip, and I'm generally in. Is there something I'm missing with Randy Arozarena?
I think he's got like two approaches, and he kind of gets enamored with one or the other, and you can see this in the bouncing around of his ground ball rate, and even his splits from Tampa to Seattle. 43% ground ball rate with Tampa, 249 BABIP, 10% barrel rate, 180 ISO. With Seattle, 47% ground ball rate, 323 BABIP, 5% barrel. I think those are the two Randy Arozarenas. There's the one who hits the ball hard, pulls it a lot on the ground, and reduces his power upside, but gets a little bit more out of his batted balls in terms of singles. And there's the one who hits fly balls. And, I think when he's at his best, he's kind of toggling between them at such an intense rate. Like when he was killing the playoffs, I think he's kind of toggling between those to where pitchers don't know where to go. If we go low, he smokes a double. If we go high, he hits a homer. I think he has those two swings and he kind of toggles them. And when he's in his bad place, he doesn't know which one to use. If he is impressed upon by the park, and Arozarena thinks, okay, in this park, I really just have to hit the ball hard on the ground, then he will maybe have a slightly better batting average. He's projected for a 296 BABIP. Maybe he could go back to, he has a 318 BABIP for his career, and he had a 323 even in Seattle in the second half. So maybe you could add 20 points of batting average to him if he's going to take this lower approach. But you would have to subtract some power. So if he stays what he was, Arozarena, in the second half with Seattle, I think you could have maybe a 245 batting average for him next year, with maybe 18 homers and 20 steals. Would you take that over a 225, 230 average and 23 homers? I think that's the range for him, depending on sort of which Randy Arozarena shows up.
I think I like him the most of this group other than Trout. I think I like him more than Ian Happ. I mean, we've seen multiple seasons of lower averages from Happ along the way. So we've already got that kind of baked in based on the types of batted balls. And we see lower stolen base totals too. I mean, even though Happ's an efficient base stealer, the volume's been there for Randy Arozarena. Unless the Mariners are going to give him fewer green lights, I guess that's a possibility, but they still strike me as a team that will have to find ways to put runs on the board because the lineup isn't just so amazing top to bottom that they're going to mash and do it, right? So they should be a pretty aggressive team overall with the guys that at least can offer stolen bases. So I'm pretty in on Randy Arozarena, even though I do think he could be one of those guys that gets caught in between those two approaches on a somewhat regular basis.
I was reminded that over at Fangraphs, they had these dashboard cards. I think it might be, if you remember, But you can choose the player rater as one of your dashboard cards. And there's a couple options on it, but what's interesting about this is, for me, is, it's giving me a weekly value for Randy Arozarena in 15-team leagues. It spits out a 46th best outfielder for last year. So that's way lower than where we are right now. Where are we? We're in the sort of 15 to 20 level.
I think by projection, kind of more.
No, we're at actually 35.
We're like 25 to 30, that range.
25 to 30, okay.
Yeah.
And he was 46 last year, but also it has the weekly value. It has the weekly value in green, and he was below 0 last year for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, and 2 were the last 2 weeks of the season. So I was actually also talking to Jeff Zimmerman about how he just cut Randy Arozarena in one of his leagues last year, because he realized that getting full playing time with that batting average was actually dragging his batting average down, and he wasn't getting enough juice out of the homers and stolen bases to make it worthwhile for his standings. Now, that was just like a specific team situation where, he looked at the standings and he looked at his team and he was like, Randy's not going to help me and he's only going to hurt me. So I'm not saying that is true for everyone, that he was totally droppable. In fact, you can see the ownership level and stayed near 100% the whole year. But I will say that that's the risk, that he hits 210 again and goes 15-15, and in some places is not rosterable, especially like 10-team leagues and leagues where your batting average is really important to you, and he's not a good OBP guy.
I think he's better than we're giving him credit for overall right now. Career 346 OBP, and even last year was a 332. Like, there's more value
with Seattle.
He brings more value to the Mariners than people realize. It's 14% better than league average by WRC Plus last year, even in a really weird down sort of year. So I'm in. I understand where the downside comes from, but I think the more likely, the median outcome here is still good enough where at price, I'm definitely in. And again, I will take Randy Arozarena over Ian Happ if the price ends up being even on draft day. Dylan Cruz, okay. A frequently discussed player on this show as well, because the player we thought he was coming out of LSU and the player he's been so far as a pro kind of seemed like two different players.
I thought he had like light tower power to all fields, and that is not what we've gotten, really.
Yeah, and I think the reminder, I like to use the Fangraph cards. I have got the prospects report open. Game power, present 45, future 60. That was a 2024 update. Raw power, present 60, future 60 as well. I think it's still supposed to be there. It just isn't. It isn't there, at least in the first run in the big leagues. But even AAA, you're like, okay, 13 homers, 25 steals in 449 plate appearances. Age appropriate. This is good production. 43.3% hard hit rate. It was 15% better than league average. Everything's fine with Dylan Cruz. There's nothing wrong there. I just thought maybe the balance would be slightly different. That would be power over speed, even if we were going to get both. So this is all good. The surprising thing for me, too, you've talked about this in the position preview series, the ground ball rate spiked during the time in the big leagues last year for Dylan Cruz. What do you think comes next? That looks like an outlier. Generally, when we see a 15 percentage point increase in ground ball rate, we don't look at that in a 31 game sample and say, that's who he is now. So I think we're getting some more power. But how much more power do you expect from Dylan Cruz in his first full season with the Nats?
Yeah, I tried to avoid some of the sort of results numbers and process and look more at process. So I try to find some comps. And so, throw up the comps list if you can, please, sir. And what I used was barrel rate, max EV, hard hit rate, and I wanted a baseline of 10 stolen bases. That was the only result stat I used because I just wanted some speed in there. And swinging strike rate below 10%. With the max EV, you'll see on this comp list that I set the baseline at 109, even though he's at 109.6, because he hit a ball 112.6 in the minors. So I wanted to kind of skew a little bit higher than he'd shown in the major leagues with the max EV. And so he has the lowest max EV of these comps, but that's his major league max EV, and he has a minor league one that puts him square in the middle of these comps. So barrel rate, max EV, hard hit, chase, swinging strike rate, and stolen base. That was the basis of these comps. The comps are Seiya Suzuki, Brandon Nimmo, Christian Yelich, Jurickson Profar, Wyatt Langford, Lane Thomas, and Corbin Carroll. Now, I think the Lane Thomas and Jurickson Profar bits are maybe upsetting, but every good comp list has, kind of the bottom and the top, right? And the average of this group that includes Cruz, that only had a small amount of time in the major leagues, the average of this group is 17 homers, 20 stolen bases, 255 average, and a 117 WRC plus. So I think we can say it almost doesn't matter what his power ceiling is. He's shown enough sort of underlying aspects to hit for some power, and he's most likely to, end up with 15 to 20 homers and maybe 20 to 30 steals and a good batting average if we look at his comps. So I think he's a good player. If you look at his chase, it's pretty good. If you look at his hard hit, 44.7, pretty good. That max EV in the minors, 112, is pretty good. Barrel rate at 6.4 is not great, but it's not terrible. And so I think sometimes we look at a prospect like this and we say, oh, here are all the things he can't do. And we forget that he makes good contact. He has a good eye at the plate. He has elite speed. And he has shown enough underlying stuff where, I think it's going to be non-zero power.
I mean, the funny thing is Dylan Cruz spent time at AA and AAA last year. He struck out less in the big leagues in 31 games than he did in 51 games at AA, where he started the year. That's a great thing to see. The K rate didn't go up; it went down. Tiny sample being accounted for. It's like, oh, okay, that's good. It's got a good approach. Maybe recognizing pitches really well. So I think it's more of like, do you see similar floor and similar categorical contributions to Pete Crow-Armstrong? They're right next to each other. Like, Crow-Armstrong has more time in the big leagues, so I think you can have a little more confidence in what we've seen so far. But I think Cruz was supposed to have a higher offensive ceiling from the first day he was on our radars. So there's a little bit of do you want that extra ceiling, or do you want that locked in, seemingly safer playing time? You mentioned lineup position for Pete Crow-Armstrong. I can see Dylan Cruz being in a more prominent spot in the Nationals lineup. Maybe that could end up being the difference.
Yeah. I think, Dylan Cruz has more offensive upside than Pete Crow-Armstrong.
That's not a dig at Pete Crow-Armstrong, I think, to be clear.
Yeah, and I think it just really has a lot. Maybe it's ogling the strikeout rate too much, but there's a lot to like in a guy who only swings and misses 10% of the time and has a 20%, 21% projected strikeout rate.
A few more names in this group to get to, though. Stephen Kwan lives in this tier.
Oh, God. Speaking of strikeout rate.
9.4% last year, 9.8% for his 9.4% last year, 9.8% for the career. Got to more power than I would have guessed. Got to 14 homers and lost some time on the IL as well. So it was a step back playing time wise after he got up to 718 plate appearances in 2023. Projections are not in agreement on the power. You see Oopsie spitting out a 7 home run total for Stephen Kwan. Steamer up at 14. So whose projection is right? More likely to be right, because I know the real answer for us is probably somewhere in the middle. But which outcome is more likely if playing time ends up coming in the high 600s for plate appearances?
I'm looking at the rolling fly ball rate graph for Stephen Kwan, and it just goes up over the course of the season, and his WOBA goes down. And I'm trying to remember that I wrote a piece about the quote-unquote lucky power hitter, and tried to find the players who least deserved their early power, and Stephen Kwan was on it, and I got yelled at. And I'm remembering that he sort of cratered. I do want to point out though that where we have Randy Arozarena being negative in so many weeks, Stephen Kwan last year was a negative value in fantasy 1 week.
One? Wow.
One. So even in the second half, when he's hitting too many fly balls and maybe taking the wrong approach and not really capitalizing on that nascent power that we thought he had, he was still providing good value. So I'm going to say the under on a 13, 14, or 11. I'm going to say 9. Might be my over under. And yet I think he's a decent play. Maybe it's for certain builds. Maybe it's you were aggressive on guys that had bad batting averages. Maybe it's your Ellie spackle, but I do think he is a good player, even if he hits 285 with 9 homers and 15 stolen bases.
Yeah, I think Kwan is easier to fit into most rotisserie situations than Luis Arias, who goes 40 picks later, even though Arias might have even more ceiling in the batting average. It's just because you get the possibility at better stuff between homers and steals for Kwan. I think the gap between those players is real.
That end position a little bit, like if you're putting Arias at first, you're ceding a lot of power to the average at that position.
Right. So you had to make up for it somewhere else.
And kind of the same as second. Like, I know that I've had these averages that I've been saying about, 15-team leagues, but there's also sort of an average per position. So whenever you put a player at a position, you're either behind or ahead of that position, So in Kwan's case, I think it's easier just to fold him into an entire outfield as opposed to being like, oh crap, I'm playing Stephen Kwan. I'm playing Luis Arias at first base. I am now like 30 homers behind pace.
Mm-hmm. The difference between a player like Kwan and Adolis García going right after. It's remarkable. Just
player squishing machine, please. Aisle 5.
I mean, García versus Arozarena, I think very similar skilled players, similar in terms of what they bring in roto. We've seen higher power ceilings from Adolis García. We've seen 4 consecutive years with a hard hit rate above 45%. We've seen barrel rates above 11.5% each year during that span. I don't think there's any doubt about the power. I think the questions are now creeping in. It's been 2 years since he swiped the 25 bases. So how much does he run even in this environment? And then is 224 the worst outcome for batting average? We just saw that. Like, is there some bounce back? Is he a 235, 245 type hitter again? What do you make of what happened to García in 2024? Does he make any more sense than Arozarena does to you as a possible bounce back candidate in this cluster?
We've got a real slowing of the sprint speed. Back when he was stealing all those bags, he had 28.4 feet per second sprint speed. Last year, he had 26.8. That's a pretty big drop. I mean, that's going from 80th percentile to 36th. I forget who I was looking at, but they had changed, by less than 0.1 seconds to first base, but he has dropped 0.15 seconds to first base. And I think that starts to make a difference, on singles and stolen bases. It also speaks to your just general ability. He was a negative on the base pass, according to StatCast, base running runs. He was a negative in the field last year, according to StatCast fielding runs. And he went from being a pretty good positive the first 3 years to last year minus 11 in terms of runs on the field. He went from a 3 outs above average in 2022 in center field to a minus 12 last year in right field. So I had heard that I don't know if everything's been reported, but there were some surgical procedures on the Rangers at the end of the year, and I don't know. He had a knee, and he'd been cleared to begin running, so he had something going on in his knee at the end of the last season. So maybe there's an injury that is underlying this, or maybe we are seeing the beginning of the decline of his physicality. And then on top of that, at 31, we are starting to enter the part where his chase rate is going to lead to bigger strikeout rates. He does have that sort of high chase rate that doesn't age well. There's a great piece. It's old, but I still believe it, which is this Bill Petty, Jeff Zimmerman piece on aging curves, component aging curves, and you can see contact outside the zone ages worse than almost any other ability for a hitter. And so I would personally take the over on all of his projected strikeout rates at 28%. I know he's 28.8 for his career, and he's been under 28, just under 28 for the last 3 years. I'm going to take the over. I think it's going to be more like a 30% K rate, maybe with like a 200 ISO, and I'm going to take the under on stolen bases. So I guess what I'm suggesting is a 220 batting average again, maybe a little bounce back in homers to 30, but maybe only 5 stolen bases.
Yeah, I think I'm willing to give up the extra power to have the balance with Randy Arozarena, so I can see myself missing out on Adolis García this year and maybe not being all that sad about it. Jasson Dominguez, last one of this group, tons of hype ever since the Yankees signed him as an international free agent years ago. Comes in, I think, as a top 30 outfielder if you run a 15-team league with Oopsie into the auction calculator. What do you think of Dominguez at this point? I feel like he's a fun pick. I don't know if he's necessarily a good one. I'm still kind of caught in between the lofty expectations we've always had for him and then reality based on how he's performed in the upper levels of the minor leagues, which I think only got further complicated by the amount of time he lost due to injury last year. He was great in 44 games at Scranton last year. I just wish we could have seen that for, 80 plus games and then a longer run in the big leagues before being all in for 2025 on what Dominguez should bring to the table.
We have an interesting discussion in the Discord right now about the difficulty of breaking into some of these first division teams that, are active in free agency and are competitive. And so, I talked once to an executive, player development executive for the Yankees, and he said, for our prospects to break in with our team, they have a high bar to clear, and it's just hard to give them time to go through the lumps. I think even Anthony Volpe got the chance to do that because that was the one year that the Yankees weren't making the playoffs, and they just let Volpe kind of go through some bumps, and that probably helped him, be at least a decent, starting shortstop when they needed him. And so Dominguez hasn't had that opportunity. I think that same year he was hurt or something. I think that was that 2023. They didn't make the playoffs, and they gave Volpe the chance, and they even brought Dominguez up, and he got 33 plate appearances. But I don't know why he got so many fewer than Volpe. I think there might have been an injury there. My point is this. I think he has done enough in the minor leagues to make me super excited. He is only 21 years old. Every time you look at a level and you say, he had a 121 WRC plus last year in AAA. He was 21, every stop that he's had, he's been 20 to 30% better than league average and one of the youngest players in his league. So I think he's done everything that he needs to do in the minor leagues. I think another team would have given him a longer shot by now. And I think that, this is actually an opportunity to buy someone that is actually somewhat on par with the kind of Langford Churio last year. Like, this is a top prospect that has runway, has a job waiting for him. It's just the Yankees here in this case actually makes me a little bit worried that they'll find some other solution, or they'll sign some guy late. They'll sign Jurickson Profar and say Dominguez is going to be in the mix. He's going to be part of the solution. But he'll have to still get by somebody. So I'm just a little bit worried about that aspect. But in terms of his quality as a player, I actually think he's like, look at his swing strike rates. Like, they're not bad. Like I think he'll have about an average strikeout rate. He's had plus walk rates everywhere. He's shown power and speed everywhere. He's hit the ball 111.6. He's had great barrel rates. I don't know. He doesn't have a problem with ground ball rates, except for in his small sample debut last year. So I see this guy as basically being a 5-tooler.
I think there's so many ways he could be helpful immediately. And if he does everything all at once, then you are talking about an early round pick next year. And those are exactly the kind of players that in pick 150 range you want to have. Like, you want to take those shots.
That's where I took Churio last year and I profited, when I got him in this group. So, I do understand that the Yankees are kind of a different beast sometimes.
If you do think about it, though, flip the calendar ahead 6 weeks, get into Grapefruit League play, and by then we'll know if they add a veteran or not. Let's assume they don't, but if they leave it open as far as the spot that's going to be Dominguez's left field predominantly, if they leave that to him and he mashes in the spring, he's easily in the helium
every week.
Shoots up a few rounds.
Exactly.
Because people want to believe with Jasson Dominguez. I think that's
the options other than him, if they don't sign, a free agent, are like Oswaldo Cabrera, Peraza, it's not everyday starters. He's the guy that profiles as an everyday starter in that outfield.
Right. Barring that extra addition. That's the only lingering doubt I think I have depth chart wise. I don't really worry about him outplaying the guys that are currently in that mix. Let's move on to what I'm calling tier 6, which is just the outfielders after Dominguez all the way down to about pick 200. That group includes Colton Cowser, who I think is actually a little more interesting than people have given him credit for so far this draft season. Josh Lowe, Brandon Nimmo, Nick Castellanos, Ceddanne Rafaela, Parker Meadows, Tommy Edman, Lane Thomas, Taylor Ward, Tyler O'Neill, Kerry Carpenter, and Victor Robles. This episode could be really, really long because there's so many outfielders just jammed in here. Do you have any favorites out of this bunch? I mean, because I think what happens when you get far enough into the draft, this is the point in the draft where ADP starts to mean a lot less as far as being reliable to what the room is likely to do. The further into the draft you go, the more likely it is someone's going to jump up a few rounds off their ADP. So if you like someone at the back of that list, I feel like you could end up in a scenario where you have to take them over nearly everybody else in the group just because of the randomness of what happens at this portion of the draft.
Yeah, there are definitely players I like in this group, but this is where something really important happens. I think if I'm in weekly leagues, I let a lot of these guys float down to the bottom. Like, I just sort of grab who drops, and I don't really try to get my guy here because there's something that all of these guys share, a risk that is bad for weekly leagues. And I think I'm going to try and pick out 2 names, maybe 3 names. The only guys that I think don't really share this risk are maybe Brandon Nimmo, maybe Tyler O'Neill, but he has the health risk, and maybe Heliot Ramos. Everybody else in this tier, as far as I can see, shares platoon risk. Just really aggressive platoon risk. You're getting to the part, it's super easy to platoon, especially a corner outfielder. You're getting to the part of the draft or the part where teams are like, hey, we have 4 outfielders. We have 4 outfielders for a reason. One of these guys are going to platoon. So I looked at percentage lefty on lefty among outfielders last year. Yordan Alvarez only saw 10% of his at-bats were lefty on lefty. I did not realize how aggressively he was being platooned. That actually takes him down a notch for me because that is plate appearances he leaves on the table. But other than Yordan Alvarez being number 1, in this group, you have Josh Lowe, who's in this tier. You have, who else you have? You have, is Dalton Varsho in this tier yet? Lawrence Butler was in the last tier.
Colton Cowser, I mean, could be in danger for that.
Cowser is in danger. He was platooned. So I think Evan Carter drops out of this list. I use a certain playing time restriction. But Cedric Mullins is in this tier. JJ Bleday is, I think, in the next tier. But you start to get a lot of platoon risk here with these players. The reason I kind of brought out Brandon Nimmo is I see him as being able to get on base against both, at least, even if he doesn't hit as well against lefties, and that I see him as one of the core players for the Mets that will play a lot. I think Nick Castellanos is a righty, so maybe he will play as often as healthy. Tyler O'Neill is a righty. He'll play as often as he's healthy. And Heliot Ramos is a righty, and the Giants need some players to play all the time. So those are the ones I pick out as possibly playing as much as they want. But Josh Lowe is here. Colton Cowser is here. He's a platoonable guy. Ceddanne Rafaela is going to play center field, and so is Jared Duran. And they're going to try and play. They say they're going to try and play Masataka Yoshida in the outfield some. Tommy Edman is a part of a team that's going to mix and match. Maybe he'll get as much time as he wants in center field. Maybe not. Lane Thomas is a righty. But it's on Cleveland. I don't know how much I trust him to get full playing time. Taylor Ward is a righty, and Taylor Ward is actually maybe my favorite in this tier because he is boring AF. He is the oatmeal of this tier. He drops in everything. His projections are going to be fine. I like Taylor Ward in this. And in dynasty leagues and stuff like that, I love Parker Meadows, and I've gotten him. But Parker Meadows does have platoon risk in terms of he's been platooned before. He's a lefty. He platoons. He's being taken right by Kerry Carpenter, who has a lot of platoon risk. He's seemingly locked into a platoon where he's not going to play against lefties at all. So this is the part of the draft where you combine injury risk and platoon risk, and you start losing plate appearances pretty hardcore.
I'm going to bring up the same tool I brought up earlier. This is another time where it's important to look back at what was happening at various points in the year, and it can fluctuate, of course, based on the health of bench options and platoon partners and different ways that the roster sort of interacts with other players on it. Kerry Carpenter, I think, has more of what you would describe as a true like strict platoon usage, because what you see, if you look at the Baseball Reference batting orders page, you'll see a pound sign when the opposing starting pitcher was a left-handed starter. And if you see throughout the second half of the season when he was healthy, I think Kerry Carpenter had one start against a left-handed starting pitcher from August 13th on. Any other time the Tigers faced a left-handed starter, Carpenter didn't start that game. But as we saw,
Parker, they kind of played with it a little bit.
Meadows, let me highlight him real quick.
Because they were trying to decide who was going to be platoon more often, him or Cole Keith.
Parker Meadows at the end of the year, and this is where defense comes in big time.
Yeah, he's also a center fielder. That's something I care about here.
His return to being in the mix post-injury, post-demotion, it was post-demotion, I think in Meadows' case, August 3rd. And I see three starts against lefties, all kind of bunched up in August where he was given a day off. But from August 29th on, Parker Meadows started every game. Played every game. He flipped down to the bottom of the order when it was a left-handed starter, but he was leading off against righties and still playing against lefties. And I think this is where you can't platoon everyone. We said that all the time. And defense matters a lot. It at least keeps you in the lineup. Yeah, maybe the first two plate appearances are going to be against that starter, but there's a good chance the bullpen won't be able to match up a lefty with you every time. So those games aren't as much of a throwaway game as they could seem. And it's opportunities to improve too. So I think that's the other key here is finding the
draft and
defenders.
Hold outfielders, and we start getting later and later in outfield. My favorite thing to do is target center fielders.
Yeah, you want guys that are going to play because of their glove. I mean, that's huge because it breaks through the possible platoon risk. I'm going back to something you said about Yordan Alvarez, just because I think there's an explanation for this. If you look, he's at the top of the board that put together. Only 10% of his plate appearances were lefty on lefty. I think that's the result of maybe the Astros just not seeing a lot of lefties, and the rest of their lineup. There's no platoon risk there. Like they don't platoon him. They're a very right-handed team. So if you're matching up even relievers against them, you're not bringing in lefties. You just
are we seeing other? Are we seeing Joey Loperfido was with them for a little bit? He's on this list.
Yeah, but I mean, like, totally different in terms of usage, though. Like,
Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't see their other outfielders there,
but they're a very right-handed team right now too.
Yeah.
So like, how you match up, I think that's what's happening with Yordan Alvarez. I don't think it's anything where they're like trying. They're not.
there's a better
they're not
way
using
to
him.
do that query. It's like I would like to say of the left-handers you could have faced.
Yes.
How many did you face?
Yeah. So, platoon risk, not a thing in the case of Yordan Alvarez, even though you didn't see a lot of lefties.
Thank you. That was something I did not understand there. But I do think that list has a lot of people with platoon risk on it.
It does.
I think Meadows this tier has a fair amount of platoon risk, and so sometimes I would hew towards, sometimes like a kind of a blink assessment. Remember we said you can only platoon basically like 3 positions on your team. So because you have to have a backup catcher. So just take catcher out or continue or say 4. If you think that this hitter is one of the top 5 hitters on their team, then they don't have as much platoon risk.
Colton
So that's
Cowser.
sort of why I'm thinking with Brandon Nimmo. Like, I think Brandon Nimmo is boring. He's old. He doesn't do as much as you want him to do in other places, but he is, I think, going to put up something that's pretty close to league average. That I was saying it's 258, 20 homers and 13 steals. He's protected for 252, 18 homers and 10 steals, basically 9 steals. So he's not going to really hurt you anywhere. He's a kind of an oatmeal-y way to keep it going. And I think he'll be high in plate appearances because Brandon Nimmo last 3 years has passed the 660 plate appearance level 3 years in a row. So I think he's safe and boring. And that's my favorite ones in this. I'm safe and boring today. Taylor Ward, Brandon Nimmo, Ian Happ. Give me safe and boring.
I think Colton Cowser is interesting because he plays more than people think against lefties. I think when you remember how his season was shaped, he was on fire to begin the year, played really well, went into a slump. His second half was actually good. And they were leading him off at points. He was getting. And
he was actually platooning with Cedric Mullins in this weird thing where he got center field at bats against lefties in center field.
Yeah, they had to move some stuff around at various points, but other than the strikeout rate, when you look at Colton Cowser in the second half last year, he was 33% better than league average, 267, 337, 477. He was important for the Orioles. That offense was struggling throughout the second half, but it wasn't his fault. So if you believe that the swing and miss is going to come down, I think the playing time numbers can at least match last year. And then you also have the possibility of a guy getting better. There's a lot of things he does really well.
Yeah, he has elite bat speed, elite sense of the zone, and non-elite feel for contact, but it's not terrible. I mean, he was regularly running sort of 9s and 10s in swing strike rates in the minors, and last year was 12.8. It's not in that sort of 15 to 16, like, he's definitely going to strike out 30% of the time level. He also played around with the weight of his bat last year, where he had so much bat speed, he almost wanted to slow his bat a little bit so that it would be in the zone longer. So he kind of swung a heavier bat in the second half. So that just speaks to me as someone who is willing to think outside the box, do different ideas, and make the most of his skills at the plate, which are elite in 2 really important places, which is eye and bat speed. So you give me someone who's elite in eye and bat speed, and I am super interested. And this guy has non-zero speed too. And at 24, Colton Cowser could steal more than his projections still. His projections are 9 to 11 stolen bases. I mean, he has the capability next year of hitting 250 with 30 homers and 15 steals. That's what I believe.
I like this setup for him more than I thought I would when last season started. I came away pretty impressed overall by what last year looked like from Cowser. The Josh Lowe questions, man, they just don't stop. What?
Yeah, he was on that list.
What are we doing? What are we doing with Josh Lowe?
I think weekly leagues have to discount him. I think that he's the new Brandon Lowe. I think that they're just going to get a lot out of him on a per plate appearance level, and they're going to shield him against lefties. Yeah, I think he's really similar to Brandon Lowe if you think about it. He's going to have a high strikeout rate, good power, good stolen bases, he is lovely in daily leagues. He is great in auto-new. He is somebody that if I could acquire in dynasty leagues that were daily lineups, I would acquire him right now. That's what I think about him. I think he has good bat speed, barrels the ball, decent approach at the plate, and athleticism that you want in a 26-year-old right in his peak. He hasn't given us his peak season yet, I don't think.
So at price, given the playing time platoon situation, it makes sense to be in on Lowe, but the weekly leagues thing is important. There will be some weeks where it's a little harder to rely on him, or partial weeks if you're playing in twice weekly lineup changes, such as the NFBC. But a lot of ways for Josh Lowe to be good, and makes it even more frustrating that he's like their Brandon Lowe, being teammates that don't pronounce the name spelled the same way differently, because that will only add to the confusion that we have here on a regular basis. Nick Castellanos, I think for a couple of years now, has been someone we've been kind of afraid of at price. Has that changed now that he's kind of falling into this 150 to 200 range overall?
I mean, I like the volume, and I did point out that he's a right-hander. That makes him he's not going to be platooned the same way as others. And he did just cut his strikeout rate, which would be something that I would sort of point to and be like, oh, this is good news, except that he is a big chaser and he's 32. So I have a feeling the strikeout rate's going to go big the other way. He had a 27.6% strikeout rate in 2023, Castellanos did, and then he had a 21.1% last year. Like, I believe the 27% more.
I see so many similarities, though, in terms of projection and what I think they're likely to do between Taylor Ward. And I don't have a pushback on Taylor Ward being the fine oatmeal option. I think with Castellanos having 2 years left on his deal at $20 million each, they're not going to pull the plug on playing time for him either. So I think it's a little bit of a spider meme situation there if you're just looking for
that's so
a really
funny
safe option.
They're so different in terms of, Ward is uber patient.
Mm-hmm. Totally different approach, but they get to the same place with it.
That's so hilarious. It's a really similar. You could just put both of them on the board and pick one, but I would say that I think, and Ward is older than people think. He's 31,
right?
And Castellanos 32. But Ward's approach should age a little better. So if I was forced to choose between the two, I would take Ward. But I do think it would be a reasonable proposition to kind of have them both in your queue, in your draft, and kind of just take one of them.
How many plate appearances would you project for Tyler O'Neill?
Yeah, I mean, a righty. So like, it's not that he's gonna. They didn't sign him to a 3-year, $50 million deal to platoon him.
No, of course not.
I'm gonna do Marcel real quick because he's got a funny up and down, and I can't eyeball it.
It is going to be lower than what all the public facing plate appearance totals are on Fangraphs right now. I'll hate to spoil that for you.
Yeah, right. Let me see if I can do it real quick. And 266. He had 266 in 2023, and then he had 383 in 2022.
I love when Eno gets a calculator out on the show.
392.
All right.
Is the plate appearance projection by Marcel's, which is just 5 times last year, 3 times the year before, 2 times the year before that, divided by 10. And that is 150 plate appearances fewer than he's projected for.
Coming off of a season in which he struck out a third of the time, ends up in a new environment, good lineup. I agree with what you say. Like, if he's healthy, they will play him as much as the projections suggest. They're not only going to play him against lefties at that price. It's not at all what you do with a player like that. Are you sure we're getting everything from Tyler O'Neill, given the number of leg injuries and things he's dealt with too? I mean, he was 4 for 4 as a base stealer last year, 5 for 5 in 2023 in this environment where steals are easier to come by. He ran more when it was harder to steal bases, but he's running less, I think, in part because of health. Like, he's a bit of a mystery for me.
Yeah, he also had some real decline in some of his physicality. This was the guy that I was looking at that I was surprised by how much his running has changed. Last year he went from a guy who he used to be elite in running. I mean, even in 2022, he was top 3 in sprint speed. Tyler O'Neill was 29.7 feet per second in 2022, 28.5 last year in 2023, 27.5 in 2024. And he went from a 97th percentile to 55th. And, you know, even when it comes to his fielding, he was a guy that could fake center field for a while. And then last year was the first time he was significantly bad. And he was significantly bad by ounce above average in left field. So, you know, maybe he played through the injuries that he would have not played through before. And it affected his sort of physical measurements, like his StatCast numbers. And he might not play through those if he has a guaranteed deal.
Well, that's not like always just like a player decision. That's also the team trying to manage him to stay healthy. Like there's a little bit of a collaborative nature here to the how much do we play him, how much do we push, when do we say it's okay to play banged up, when do we not say that, right? That could be different from org to org. It could be different when you've got the multi-year deal, who your next best option is. All of those things matter. I tend to think, you know, Tyler O'Neill is fine where he's going right now because he would fall into that group of players that you still get to replace when he's down, even if there's a higher likelihood that he spends some time on the IL based on the injuries he's amassed over the course of his career. I just think there's a solid player there. I just think that your team has a different package of risk. This tier has different packages of risk, and you've got this sort of like young player who hasn't really shown us all of it yet risk, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have this sort of old player who could be injured risk. And Tyler O'Neill in some ways has a little bit of both, and just that, like, has he really shown us, like, you know, 700, 650 plate appearance, like this is everything kind of, you know, this is what we're dreaming upon, you know, and yet he also has now old player hurt risk on top of that. I think I would rather take Cowser, Dominguez, Lowe, if I'm going to take some risk on, because I could be like, oh, these guys are young and they're going to show us what they haven't showed us before. And if I'm going to go old, I'd rather go Taylor Ward, Nick Castellanos, who have been really boring and have kind of done it every year. So Tyler O'Neill falls in between. I'd rather have Parker Meadows, I think, than Tyler O'Neill. So, you know, he falls in between in a way that I don't like. Kerry Carpenter is the player in this group that deserves a little extra attention, I think. It's like when you look at what he does on the big side of platoon, it's phenomenal. And I probably underestimated him every day up until the postseason last year, and now I've finally come on board with like, okay, this is real. This is a player we should care a lot more about in fantasy, even if the usage in strict platoon does hamper the value in weekly leagues a bit. Because as I mentioned earlier, we know Kerry Carpenter is going to get plate appearances even in the games he doesn't start. That's obviously part of how that roster is built. Who are the comps? Like, who does he remind you of? There's really not a ton of speed there. It's like 6 steals over 236 games, 868 plate appearances. Again, a little wonky because sometimes those are pinch hit opportunities and not just full games started. So he doesn't have much in that category.
Jock Peterson? I mean, it doesn't look anything like him.
Kind of the way Jock's used now, I think it's similar.
Yeah.
Carpenter being 5 years younger certainly is a good thing. But I've found for a few years...
He doesn't have the max EV and the bat speed to support some of these barrel rates.
Jock has shown more batting average downside so far, too.
That's true.
And it's been a little less these last couple of seasons. You look at the 274 and the 275 from 2022 and 2024.
But it's a very kind of pull, fly ball, barrel... you know, a little bit less weight for it, a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, but Carpenter's barrel rate last year, 16.9%. It's better than anything we've seen from Jock. Little more of a free swinger, chases outside the zone more than Jock ever has. But I think in terms of how he functions on the roster, I think that's where the similarities are. And having that power-heavy contribution with some batting average risk, even though we haven't really seen that much downside in that area from Carpenter yet. I just think he's a fascinating player because of the formats we play in. If you're in a daily league, he'd probably go quite a bit earlier because you would end up using him much like the Tigers do. You just have to mix and match and manage your roster a bit.
Yeah, I think best ball is a good one for him too, because he's going to hit weeks where he just sees righties, right?
Yeah, that'll happen sometimes.
So if he sees a week where he just sees righties, or with his kind of a more aggressive pull approach, I think he could see a week where he just hits like 4 homers in the week. So I like him as a best ball guy, even though, normally with best ball, you're like, oh, I want all the Rockies, and he's in Detroit. Like, he'll have weeks where he's away from Detroit, So I think he's better in best ball. I think he's better in daily lineups. I think he suffers a little bit in kind of main event, weekly leagues, draft and holds, because he's going to siphon plate appearances away from you.
I do think in leagues where you can make moves, the normal size bench leagues that are weekly, that's where I have the hardest time rostering him. I think in draft and hold, I'm not as worried about it, because I think the thresholds for what you need playing time wise go down because of the attrition on your roster and not being able to replace guys.
Free agency, yeah.
Right. So I think there's a little bit of a difference for me in those formats too, with how I think about Carpenter at this point. But yeah, it just seems like big side platoon is what he is. I trust the skills. It just takes kind of a specific scenario for him to make a lot of sense.
Where are we with him? Let me see here. If we're talking about by average draft position, we're talking about 47. So for in a 10-team league, your 5th outfielder, oh God, I love that, because especially if you have daily lineups, you could take him as your 5th outfielder, and then have somebody on your bench that you can just have someone super cheap on your bench that you just bring in for the other days. Like, you can have someone like Jung-Hoo Lee later that's just, comes in to give you some singles off the bench, when Kerry Carpenter's not playing. That's the player smushing machine, and that would work. So 47 though, in a 15-team league, he's now your 3rd outfielder, which suggests that, like, are you going to try and platoon, like if it's an auto-new situation, or something like that, are you going to try and platoon 3 outfielder positions?
You can do a lot of platooning and auto-new. The roster's bigger than a big league roster.
I've actually had trouble platooning 3 outfield positions. Like
3 in the outfield, all in the outfield might be tough.
And then generally platooning 3 positions, I've just found it difficult because you will keep injured players on your bench. You have to keep people for other positions. And so I've found that my magic number for like platoonable spots in auto-new is closer to 2. But yeah, you could, it's just a little bit early to be taking a platoon guy in 15-team leagues. I think I'd be searching for players who play all the time right now.
I think you mentioned him at the beginning of the segment. Brandon Nimmo, he doesn't really get dinged badly. He sits against some lefties, but not all lefties, and he hits so high in the order.
He's in my boring Taylor Ward Castellanos group. Like,
I think I like him the most of the trio. I think it's the quality of the Mets lineup is fine. It's good, like as we saw last year, similar to the Phillies.
I think it's the best approach of the 3, really, because he's, Ward does get in trouble where he's trying to hit fly balls a lot, and Nimmo is a little bit more of a balanced approach.
And then Nimmo comes out and swipes 15 bags in 15 attempts. I think that's more steals than he had in the previous 4 seasons combined.
But he used to be a center fielder and stuff, so I always thought he could steal more. Like, in my head, he steals bags. It's surprising me when I look back in his old steals totals. But I guess he's had a lot of hamstring injuries, I think.
Yeah, pretty healthy though the last 3 years. Look at these plate appearance totals: 673, 682, 663. So I would say I think Brandon Nimmo is a little bit underrated, and coming off of the season where the average dipped down to 224 for reasons that probably aren't all sustainable, repeatable. I think there's a pretty decent bounce back coming from him. And as always, there's a boost in OBP leagues from Nimmo as well.
Dude, we are in trouble. We're only at like the 50th outfielder, dude.
Yeah, we're definitely
going to have to breeze through like 50 outfielders tomorrow.
Or it's like a 4-hour pod,
We can't
clear out that calendar, buddy. We're starting.
We might
at 5
have to leave some out like the deep league. We might have to do like a real deep league one pod that's just like deep league players.
Maybe I can come up with a new format in the brief time between the end of this episode and the start of part 3. Maybe I can come up with
Are we going to
something.
try to do one more tier to make it a little bit easier on ourselves?
We could start it. We make the rules like on the fly sometimes.
All right, what's in tier 7?
No.
We're not done with tier 6 yet.
There's a guy on the screen. There are only 2 names on the screen. We talked about one, and I'm not allowed to talk about the other.
I'm not into Robles. I'm not into taking Victor Robles here. I just think that we've seen so much of a boom and bust cycle, and for us to believe that this is the guy that comes to Seattle and conquers, his own swinging strike problems in the past and does it in Seattle. Like, I don't know why. I don't believe it. And, his projections by Oopsie, which factor in his bat speed for below average work, with the bat 242, 317, 348. That's sort of what I believe out of him. I mean, his career is 247, 321, 370. So, and he's in Seattle as opposed to Washington. So for this part, so I think it's totally believable that that's what his output will be. And if that's what his output will be, are they going to keep playing him? I guess it's the Mariners, but like that's a 98 WRC plus. Maybe they will. I don't know. They don't really have options other than if Mitch Haniger and Mitch Garver both are doing okay. Then Victor Robles can become a backup, I think. Or if Dominic Canzone breaks out.
Yeah, I mean, the alternatives are so uninspiring that the guy that swore off Victor Robles forever is slowly falling back in that direction. Okay, a couple things.
Canzone hits the ball hard and has struck out less in the past, but he was so bad last year that I don't know, but his projections are actually better than Robles.
I will try my best to bring some very basic analysis that justifies this ridiculousness right now.
Yeah.
Even in the brief time that Robles was healthy in 2023, we saw some things that were kind of similar to what happened in Seattle last year. We saw a 299, 385, 364, again, just 36 games, massive injury, just didn't play much. A slash line that looked a lot like what he did last year with a little more thump, 433 slug being kind of the big difference. The 126 ISO from Robles, that was with a 307 average last year, was his best ISO since 2019. And that's when this whole mess for me started. I trust the speed. I trust the playing time because the depth chart is not good. And I think this might just be one of those situations where a fresh start in an organization with reset expectations might be okay. I think this could be, let's try to find a comparable, it took longer than we hoped for things to work out, even if they didn't hit superstar level. What if this is like another Jurickson Profar type story? Top prospect that had health problems that hampered development, and after several years of trying to make those adjustments to the big leagues, it actually happened. And it wasn't superstar, but it was still good. Is that a possibility for Victor Robles? And I'm saying this as someone, again, who tried to swear off the possibilities ever happening. I've tried to be an open-minded, reasonable person about what happened a year ago, and I think there's enough here to justify him as a making up bags sort of play with non-zero power. I think you could still say he has non-zero power. 6.2% barrel rate, best we've ever seen from Victor Robles. Is it going to go up from there? Doubt it. Probably not. But if you're chasing speed, I think you could do worse for a fourth outfielder than Victor Robles.
Yeah, I pulled up Sean Figgins's page for some reason.
Talking about Mariners and stolen bases, I guess, and your brain just thought of Sean Figgins.
Well, just also like the viability of a player that doesn't play a premium defensive position and doesn't really have great power. Figgins had some great years in there, at least for fantasy purposes. I also think that the options are bad in Seattle, because even if you do have some love for Dominic Canzone still, there's a chance that Canzone breaks out and just replaces the Haniger-Garver situation, which is not great. Right.
You have a soggy DH situation. You have, is this the worst infield ever? Rayleigh, Leo Rivas, Dylan Moore, JP Crawford. That's a bad infield. It's January, so anything's possible. It could change. I mean, I'm not trying to be rude. Like I'm
right.
Have you seen?
I mean, Dylan Moore is a utility guy. Like he's one of the best utility guys maybe of the recent time. He's been a really good utility guy, but he's a utility guy. Donovan Solano has been a bench guy for many years. Luke Rayleigh is probably the best hitter of the bunch.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very
Ryan Bliss is an untested
situation.
Rookie with nothing going on, and JP Crawford has been losing defensive viability over the last few years, although he bounced back a little bit there, and profiles as a slightly above average, offensive, slightly below average defensive shortstop. He's probably the best overall player of the group.
Yeah, I mean, JP Crawford's fine. Like it's just like, man, like usually you look at a depth chart like that and you can pick out maybe 2 players that at draft day cost that you like. Oh yeah, I could roster those guys, and I look at the depth chart of those positions, and I'm like, yeah, JP Crawford as like my 3rd or 4th shortstop in a draft and hold or a hail only.
Yeah.
But
it's Luke Rayleigh in a daily league.
They're all role guys for me. I mean, obviously Cal Raleigh behind the plate is great. We talked about it in the catcher episode, but man, they are just thin on the infield for bats that are viable at this point. All right, we'll break tier 7 open. We're going to get maybe like 2 or 3 players in probably before this episode has to come to an end.
We should try. I'm gonna read them out for you. Does that make sense?
Well, we'll just split it. We'll split a few names off. Okay. Let's just cover the first 3 guys in tier 7. It starts with Heliot Ramos. It includes Cedric Mullins, who came up in passing earlier, and Lourdes Gurriel Jr. As you start to look at this group, I guess I'll name the rest. We'll get to them in detail in part 3. Profars here: Jung-Ho Lee, Jake McCarthy, Jorge Soler, Alec Burleson, Willie Castro qualifies almost everywhere, George Springer, Brendan Donovan, Jesus Sanchez, Byron Buxton, and TJ Friedl. Huge group, spans all the way down to pick 250. Do you see anything from the first few names like Ramos, Mullins, and Gurriel that make you think that they're a little bit underdrafted relative to that group we just talked about?
Yeah, I think Heliot Ramos is a righty on a team that is desperate for an everyday player and also desperate for young stars that, capture the imagination of their fans. Ramos is bilingual, fun, hits the ball hard, strikes out a little bit too much, but, has an all-fields approach that probably serves him pretty well in San Francisco. Is not a terrible defender, but it's not a great one. He's definitely not a center fielder. I think the playing time projections on him are light. I think that if you look across that roster in San Francisco and you're looking for your 5 everyday players, he's in that list. You're talking about Willie Adames, Matt Chapman, Jung-Ho Lee, and then you start with the ... dots. And that's only 3 names. So Ramos is comfortably in that top 5, and they're only projecting him in projection systems because it's San Francisco and whatever, he only had 518 last year or whatever. They're projecting him for 570 to 600. I even think he'll be near the top of that lineup too. So I think you could give him 640, 650. That gives him just a couple more homers. If you use oopsie projections for Heliot Ramos too, you get 25 homers because of the bat speed. So now you're talking 250, 25 homers. They're only projecting 7 steals, but he had 6 steals last year. Maybe he gets more comfortable. You get 10 steals. I mean, 250, 25, 10 is what we were hoping for a lot of the players in the last year. So he could actually, he's the first guy in this tier. Of course, he could be in the last tier. But this is comfortably the best player in this tier for me.
My hesitation with Ramos, I think, is that against righties last year, 26.8% K rate. That doesn't crush you. He did hit homers against righties, but it was a 240, 286, 387 slash line against same-handed pitching. So the possibility to lose a share of that role if he begins with an everyday role, I think it's there. It leaves the door open for major playing time loss if he doesn't.
Somebody else steps forward. So you're like, Tyler Fitzgerald stepped forward as an everyday guy,
or even if it's not like a strict platoon where he's only playing against lefties. He loses a start or 2 every week against righties. That starts to kind of ding him in a way where he becomes a little bit like the big side platoon guys, but also mashes on the small side and doesn't do enough against same-handed pitching to really make up that gap. That's the worry. It's just like, man, 88 WRC plus against righties. Given their situation, they should give him another look and see how it goes. I just think he has to take another step forward in that split, especially if he wants to lock down that playing time. It's nice to see a 222 WRC plus in a split. That was against lefties last year. He just destroyed lefties.
Well, what does your fancy platoon chart say about Mr. Mullins? Because I lived through that, and it seemed like things changed near the end of the season. He was definitely at some point almost in a strict platoon and a weird one with Colton Cowser, if I remember right.
Yeah, fancy
but what
chart,
did he
man.
do? What did he do down the stretch in like September?
Let's start with perception. What is your perception? How many times, do you think he sat against most lefties, all lefties? What was your perception of Mullins? Most lefties.
Most to all.
Let's make the cutoff mid-August, August 14th. Started against one on the 16th, sat against 3 consecutive lefties the week after that.
I remember that.
Sat against 2 more lefties that weekend. That was a bad week for Mullins for playing time. They had seven games that week, 5 against left-handed starters.
And that was kind of his nadir. People were dropping him, definitely.
Got a 1 start against a lefty on the 1st of September. Didn't see another lefty as a team, as a starter until the 17th. Mullins started that game, sat on the 20th, was back in the lineup on the 22nd, and then sat against a righty on the 28th. So, yeah, it was not great as far as the leaking playing time against lefties for Mullins.
And for his career, Mullins, who used to be a switch hitter and gave that up, for his career, Mullins has a 78 WRC plus against lefties, 119 against righties. It's in a decent amount of splits, 775 plate appearances against lefties. I know that there's some numbers that say you'd still want to regress that, blah, blah, blah. I think he's bad against lefties. I think with the history of him being used to be a switch hitter, I think he's just never going to be good against lefties. He is, however, a center fielder, and so sometimes I think they just put him in to have good defense out there in center field. He's probably, it's getting close because he's getting older and Cowser's younger, but I would say he's probably a better defender than Colton Cowser in center. So there's some days where they're like, we know lefty's starting, but we really want to have good outfield defense for whatever reason, the pitcher or whatever. So he's going to be a little bit better than a strict platoon, but I think he's sort of capped as a platoon guy. And so when they project him for 525 to 580 plate appearances, that's what I believe. Better in daily leagues, still has the legs, still has non-zero power, still a decent player. But the batting average, I don't know if it'll ever go back to where it used to be. And he is 30. At some point, he's going to be a platoon corner outfielder. The contract negotiations aren't going to go that well, and his fantasy value from here on out is only going down.
It's interesting. He gets to the power pretty consistently, even since the 30 home run season, 16, 15, and 18 the last 3 seasons for Mullins, with 4.9, 6.5, and 4.8% barrel rates. This is a left-handed Victor Robles in terms of the roto, power, speed, underlying numbers, and then the question comes out to average. If you believe that the average we've seen from Vic, partial season in 23 and then time last season, is real, there's a big gap there. But those are the two guys.
Trying to pull every fly ball. Look at those fly ball rates, 49%. You're not going to get a good BABIP if you're pulling, if you're trying to hit 50% fly balls.
Right. The approach sort of supports that whittling BABIP you see year over year from Cedric Mullins. I think he's okay where he's going. I don't think he's a must target or a must avoid player. I think you outlined our concerns for playing time really well. One more who belongs, I think, in the oatmeal crew. We were talking about Taylor Ward. We were talking about Nick Castellanos. Lourdes Gurriel Jr., I submit him as a player that does a lot of similar rotisserie things and maybe brings kind of a happy medium, not as much chase as Castellanos, but not as much patience as Taylor Ward, similar in age. Good lineup in Arizona, so supporting cast is nice.
The best contact rate out of all of them?
Lowest K rate, 18.3%. Yeah, it should be.
And maybe most boring, batted ball stats of the 3.
Yeah, but another option if you're kind of looking for similar like backup plans, basically, is he at least a competent backup plan if you
Why does
miss
he
on
lose playing
Ward and
time?
Castellanos?
He had 592 in 2023. Lourdes Gurriel did, and he had 553 plate appearances last year. Why does he lose playing time? Is it his defense? His defense isn't great. Does he get replaced in games defensively? I think he does.
Fancy chart man, gonna take a look at the starts.
Yeah, you fancy chart man.
I don't know how I won that award on this show. There was some kind of IL stint in September because he didn't start a game between September 2nd and the 19th. Like, it's a clear gap there.
But Jake McCarthy is a lefty who plays better defense than he does.
Yeah, they pick their spots, I guess, to give him days off against righties mostly. That's just, every 2 weeks or so, it doesn't play against the righties. Kind of a pattern if there is one. So it's just.
I prefer Ramos. I think,
off.
What you also have to think about is this is the part of your draft where you're starting to lose. You're starting to draft players who won't be on your roster at the end of the season.
Yeah, especially in a 12-team league. Yeah.
But even in 15-team leagues, you start getting to like about 50% of the players you're drafting here make it with you all the way, And if that's the case, then I may want to switch a little bit. There's like kind of a moment. Gurriel's like right there, and Ward and Castellanos. Maybe I'd like to pair like a Ramos with a Ward, Castellanos, or Gurriel. You know what I mean? Like somebody who has a little bit more upside, so that I definitely wouldn't want to continue being, who I've been in this podcast today, all the way through this and end up with Taylor Ward, Nick Castellanos, and Lourdes Gurriel Jr. as like my final three outfielders. I think there would be something missing. I just wouldn't have the upside that other people would be chasing at all. And I'd basically be so much oatmeal that it either works out and I'm okay, or they're old, one of them breaks, and I didn't buy anybody that was better than expected. You know what I mean?
It's a group that's just more likely to meet their projection or underperform it than a group that includes someone that's going to go over or way over. I mean, you may get a slight bump over, but it just feels like the ceiling comes down quite a bit. It would be, too much oatmeal. It'd be 3 or 4 scoops instead of like a normal, healthy 1 or 2. You can only eat so much of it. It's just true.
That's right.
Join our Discord.
We got down to 53. Good luck to us.
Yeah, we'll get 87 outfielders or so into the part 3. I'm sure that's doable. Join our Discord. I'm sure we're going to miss outfielders tomorrow, so you can ask us about those players, and we'll make that cutting room floor episode maybe again coming off the outfielders. I think that's going to be a necessary part of the build here for us as we look at these next few weeks. Be sure to jump in on those Hive rankings. We at least got far enough in where we talked about enough outfielders where I think you could get through 50 if you want to. If you want to wait until we get to part 3, that is fine too. You can go back and fill out rankings for the other positions we've covered so far all around the infield. Those are all available in the Discord. You can find enoceras.bsky.social on Blue Sky and dvr.bsky.social. That is going to do it for this episode of Rates and Barrels. We're back with you on Friday.
Thanks for listening.